Hello, my name is Stephen Lapey, and I am the chapter head for the Norumbega Chapter in Massachusetts, and I am the proprietor of Stevens Canoe Works, where we build a few new canoes, do repairs, and do restorations on wood and canvas canoes. It was John Fitzgerald's idea to do a restoration on a really beat-up Chestnut Ogilvy that one of our members, Lou Muchler, had planned to restore. Unfortunately, we lost Lou even before he had a chance to start work on it. His family offered it to John, and then he convinced us that it would be fun to do the restoration as a club project to be donated to the WCHA for the auction at the following year's assembly, all in Lou's memory. Well, that got the ball rolling, and we've been doing these projects since then. To date, we have had 9 major projects, all going for either auction or as a raffle item at the assemblies. This evening we will review our projects and talk a little about each of the canoes involved. We'll have a little time after the slideshow for any questions or discussions we want to have. That first project was a 16-foot Chestnut Ogilvy. Lou Muchler's grand plan was to restore this relic to use paddling with his young grandkids. He wanted a nice stable canoe for this, and the Ogilvy would have been a very good choice. This canoe came to us as a basket case. There wasn't much left to work with. As you can see in this picture, early on in the project, the stems, inwales, and decks have been removed, and a younger Fitz is chopping away at a rotted rib tip. By the time we were done with this canoe, it had new stems, new inwales and outwales, new decks, 3 new ribs, a lot of new planking, a new keel, new stem bands, new canvas, filler, paint, and varnish. It may have been more practical to build a new one. A few days later, we were putting some new inwales in the Ogilvy. I think we use Sitka spruce mainly because we can get it locally. It's expensive, but since local spruce is difficult to find in long, clear lengths, that's what we use. My goodness, we almost used all of our clamps getting these inwales in place. In 13 days, we installed new stems, decks, inwales, and a couple of new ribs. We were making good progress. Somehow, after installing the new decks and inwales, we managed to end up with a perfectly straight canoe. Ahead of us will be planking repairs, a bunch of new rib tips, stripping the old varnish, sanding and varnishing before she'll be ready for canvas. Somewhere along the way, we moved the canoe to Fitz's shop in Concord for the rest of the work, and we sent out a call for volunteers to come on a cold Saturday morning in February of 2010 to put the canvas on the hull. The big surprise here was the number of members that showed up to help. We had 16 pairs of hands to stretch the canvas and to attach it. John found a source for the number 6 canvas in Florida and ordered a 7-yard cut in a 72-inch width. Number 6 is what Chestnut used on these heavy-duty Ogilvy canoes. This is the only time we've ever used this weight of canvas. I'm not particularly looking forward to another opportunity to use number 6 canvas. Eventually, we got the canvas filled, and while that filler was curing, John was able to resurrect the original thwarts, make new seat frames, and weave the cane in the official Chestnut pattern. A coat of sea green bright side enamel and new outwales brought us up to this point. Here's the finished Ogilvy at Franklin Pierce, ready for the auction block. Our final touch for the canoe was the phrase we had a local sign painter place on each side of the hull: "See you in the trees." We had a lot of correspondence with Lou Muchler over the years, and every time he would send a note, he would sign off with, "See you in the trees." I asked him once just what he meant by that, but he just grinned. That was Lou. Bottom line, the Ogilvy drew $1,200 at auction. I still think that buyer got a real bargain. The WCHA got a nice donation, and the Norumbega volunteers could all be proud of their part in the project. The Ogilvy was so well received at the assembly in 2010 that in 2012 we were assigned the task of completing a replica of a Rushton Indian girl that had been started at the 2011 assembly. A group of attendees were going to build a complete canoe in 4 days and have it ready to sell on day 5. Well, there just wasn't enough time for them to complete it, and when the partial canoe went on the auction block, nobody was interested in bidding on it. It was pulled from the auction, and later it came to us. We finished it, took it back to Paul Smith's, and it sold for a very high price. In this picture, we see a couple of our volunteers, Larry Meyer, Bill Clements, and Ted Harrigan, working on attaching the canvas to the hull. That was just part of the work that we had to do on it. Here's a group of volunteers rubbing in the filler on the canvas. I think that's Benson with the canvas mitt, along with Paul Kelly, Bill Clements, and Greg O'Brien. It took some creative clamping to get those double gunnels to fit at the ends. Once everything was lined up, 4 screws went in from the outside. The rest of the screws went in from the inside to the outer gunnel. We didn't have a Rushton tag, so we made up a decal for the bow deck. It said J.H. Rushton, Indian Girl, made by the Wooden Canoe Heritage Association, 2012. Here's a picture of the Indian Girl as it was completed in our shop and ready to go to the assembly. As you can see, it came out pretty nice. The following year, we were rewarded with a well-worn Chestnut cruiser from the Keewaydin camp in Ontario. We dragged the Cronje home from Killbear Provincial Park in Ontario after Andre Cloutier had liberated it from the camp. Old number 36 received a full restoration here and went to assembly in 2013, where it became a raffle item. Thousands of tickets were sold, and the winning ticket was held by a local couple who had stopped by, saw all the excitement, and purchased 1 ticket. That's all it took to become a winner. Since then, Larry and Nancy Bowie have become active members of the WCHA. When this Cronje arrived, it was in pretty sorry condition. 30-plus years of tripping at Keewaydin had taken its toll. It had been repaired and recovered several times in the past at Keewaydin, but by now they felt she wasn't worth fixing up again, and it became available to us. This is just a small example of the damage we found in the Cronje. Note the Wanigan ribs. These double ribs are in the center of the canoe to place wanigans on and to protect the ribs. For those who don't know, a wanigan is a large wooden box used to carry gear and food, and they're carried over the portages with leather top lines. Some planking's been removed and a couple of ribs have been taken out, and now it's time to start putting it back together. Eventually it all came together and was ready to go to assembly. It got the number 36 at each bow and the big letter K at the stern, just like she did at her days at Keewaydin. For 2015, a gentleman in northern New Hampshire offered us an Old Town canoe at a very low price. He knew for certain that it was a 1919 HW, as he had the build information from the factory. When John Fitzgerald and I saw pictures of the canoe, it was apparent to us that it was not an Old Town, but something possibly more interesting. When we went to pick it up, it turned out to be a Robertson, and we were thrilled. The owner had provided the folks at Old Town with the Robertson's 5-digit serial number, and he was given information on the Old Town with that same number. The mere fact that the name Robertson was stamped into each thwart didn't change the owner's mind, but it told us just what we had found. This Robertson was a big hit at the 2015 assembly. Here in this picture we see Ed Moses, Larry Meyer, and Ted Harrigan taking a break while attaching a gunnel cap. All finished and ready to go. I've always liked these wide sitting thwarts. On this one, the bow seat has a brass ring in it for a sailing mast. We came back in 2016 with a Kennebec Charles River canoe. Kennebec was a featured builder for that year's assembly, so our canoe was a perfect fit for the auction. This Kennebec was one of 2 in a collection from a defunct canoe museum up in Maine. Benson Gray managed to get them both for us. We sold one to have some cash to fix up the better of the 2. The better of the 2? That's debatable, but we went with it because it was the older, dating from 1911. The red paint on the inwales was fun to get off. The decks were no problem at all. We just made new ones. Here's Lawton Gaines, Roger Andrews, and Greg O'Brien working on the Kennebec. I'm seeing in this picture at least 10 new ribs, and if you look real close, you may notice that this Kennebec was made with a wide Morris-type stems. In the auction tent at Paul Smith's College, she was the last item on the schedule and attracted a lot of bidding, finally selling for over $2,700, another nice WCHA donation. For the 2018 auction, we had planned to do a restoration of a Chestnut Indian Maiden, a very rare model that would be a good fit with the assembly theme, Chestnut Canoes and Bill Mason. Mackie Mongold generously donated the canoe and hauled it from Florida to Paul Smith's, where we moved it from one trailer to another for the trip to Massachusetts. Unfortunately, when the canoe got here, a quick inspection revealed that the canoe was too far gone to be a viable project. Almost every rib would need to be replaced, along with most of the planking, the inwales, the outwales, and the special Indian Maiden decks. The best place for this, regrettably, was a trip to the burn pile. With the Indian Maiden off the table, it came time to come up with a plan B for this project. John Fitzgerald came across an ad on the main Craigslist for an original Chestnut building form that had come out of the factory when they shut down in 1979. This would be perfect. We could make a brand new Chestnut canoe from an authentic factory form. Alas, it was not to be. Jeff Morrill and I took some time to travel out to Charlemont, Mass. To inspect the form, and what we found was a form for a 70s vintage Chestnut Deer, which was the old pal that they modified to be wider and deeper than the originals. Not a really pretty canoe, and the form was in very poor condition, having been left to the weather for many years. It would be a major project just to get that form back to usable condition, so we left it in Charlemont. Now we progress to Plan C. Continuing with the theme, Chestnut Canoes and Bill Mason, why not build a new 16-foot Chestnut Prospector, Bill Mason's favorite canoe, for the 2018 auction? Here at the canoe shop, we had a Prospector form that could be put to use, and a new build would be a good learning experience for our members who have perhaps done some repairs and restorations, but not a new build. This picture shows the form in the shop with the ribs already attached to it. We're already on our way to a new project. Once all the ribs were on the form and it was faired out, it was time for some planking work. Here we see Gary Emerald, Jeff Morrill, John Fitzgerald, and Stephen Hodge fitting a plank on one side of the Prospector. Soon enough, the planking was completed and the hull came off the form. The inwales were joined, the decks were installed, the interior was sanded and varnished. Then it was canvassed and filled in the usual manner, and when the filler had cured for 5 weeks, it got a first coat of red enamel, as you see here. Now the canvas is ready to be trimmed. The only work left will be installing the seats and thwarts, adding the outwales, and attaching the stem bands. At Peterborough, the Prospector was on display and received rave reviews. Bob Bundy from New Hampshire was the high bidder, and he took it home with him on the roof of a rental car. I often wondered what the rental car agreement said about carrying things on the roof. Anyway, Bob has since sold the canoe, and I understand that it performed as expected on a canoe trip in the Boundary Waters area in Minnesota. For the planned 2020 assembly, we did a restoration on a 1911 Old Town Ideal. The Ideal was a Charles River model canoe in AA grade with all mahogany, rails, decks, thwarts, and seats. It was the top-of-the-line Old Town in 1911, and it's still an Ideal canoe today. Member Mike Parr generously donated this Ideal to the chapter. He had owned it for some time, but had never gotten started on restoring it. The Ideal had been restored once before, about 20 years previous, but for some reason it had been left out in the weather and now needed more work. Once we got into it, we discovered that it needed a lot more work. We ended up replacing all the mahogany inwales, the decks, and seats, along with too many ribs to count, and almost all of the planking on the bottom of the canoe. There was some incredible damage and some strange previous repairs on this old town. This steel inwale patch must have been from the previous restoration. One glance at this repair made it definite the entire inwale would need to be replaced. With the new inwales in place, it was time to install the replacement decks. True to the original, we used all Honduras mahogany for the new parts. Soon it began to look like a canoe again. Mostly complete, except for the stem bands, the ideal was all set to go to Paul Smith's for the 2020 assembly, but with a COVID situation, the assembly was canceled. The ideal was moved to member Bob Gorman's barn, where it rested for 2 years, and then taken to the 2022 assembly. Unfortunately for us, there were 6 nice canoes up for auction, and by the time this one came up, the strong buyers had already made their purchases. The old town was sold for $800, far less than it's worth. The good news is that the buyer was Mike Parr's son, Will, and the canoe has come back home to the Parr family. The phone rang one day, and it was a lady from Marlborough, Massachusetts. That's about an hour from my home, with an old town canoe that had belonged to her late husband. She wondered if I could help her sell it or find a new home for it. I told her about our chapter's restoration projects, and she immediately offered it to us. I was there the next day to pick it up. Upon getting it in the shop, it was apparent that it was going to come back nicely, and I think the Norumbega volunteers did a pretty good job on this restoration. The canoe came with 2 Old Town paddles and the original bill of sale. The original owner was a Vietnam veteran. He had purchased it with his veteran's bonus that he had received when he returned from service. He used it for 20 years or more before succumbing to a weird cancer that was traced to his exposure to tainted food that he experienced in Vietnam. We did the restoration and made the donation to the WCHA in the member of William F. Borowski, Specialist 4th Class, U.S. Army. Here we see Chuck Cossaboom, Jeff Morrill, and Stuart Fall taking her apart at one of our early sessions. Clamping and screwing the new outwales. The original outwales were almost perfect, but for one damaged spot. We may have been able to patch in a piece of new wood, but it would never look right, so we went with new mahogany for both outwales. I think I remember putting a couple of new ribs in her, and a few feet of new western red cedar planking. The tips of the stems needed some new wood, but other than that, it was a pretty easy restoration. This is the decal that we made up to put on the stern deck to show that the canoe was restored in William Borowski's memory. At the assembly in 2022, there was a large assortment of nice canoes up for auction, so auctioneer Jack Nettleson made the decision to make the trapper a raffle item rather than a live auction. I saw thousands of tickets go into the box, and when the winning ticket was drawn, it was held by Philippe Dusser of Miami, Florida. This is Philippe and Sarah Hayes posing with their new canoe. You can read more about this canoe in Wooden Canoe, issue number 230. That's our most recent issue. For 2023, we have finished what has become our most complicated project ever, the restoration of a long-deck Charles River courting canoe. And it's not your usual courting canoe. Possibly, this is the only courting canoe that has ever been used for a canoe trip on the Allagash River in northern Maine. In 1961, Nels Huskinen, a young apprentice at General Electric in Lynn, Massachusetts, went on a canoe trip with some co-workers on the Allagash River from Chamberlain Lake all the way to the St. Johns River. Somehow the canoe survived and went on to other adventures, finally ending up in his son Vico's garage. When the son sold the house, the canoe had to go, and fortunately we got the call. Almost a year ago, our chapter started working on a pretty well worn out Charles River Courting Canoe for a restoration project. When I first saw it, I thought it was beyond repair, but on second glance I noticed that those beautiful 52-inch mahogany decks were salvageable, and that made it a go. Bringing it out for inspection at the canoe shop, our members got all excited over this canoe and could not wait to get started on the restoration. With the serial number of 2180 stamped in the stem, it must have been made by one of the major builders on the Charles River, possibly Arnold, Waltham, or Nutting. It's not a Kingsbury. He did not make 2100 canoes. Robertson had a habit of stamping his name into all his boats, so exactly who made this canoe will have to remain a mystery. Here we see Tom Anderson, Paul Cheros, Bob Weatherall, Mike Parr, and Chuck Possibum getting started on stripping the canoe down to its bare bones. Both ends of the canoe looked like this, the usual rot from being stored outside. Only the first 6 inches of each of the deck panels was bad. I felt the small patches would bring them back, and it did. The king planks were beyond repair, so we planned on replacing them. The original stem bands were intact, and they only needed a good buffing to look like new. The little loop at the top for a painter ring is unusual. I think it's kind of cute. After some basic repairs to the stems and inwales, enough to keep things together, it was time for what I always dread, stripping the interior. Here's Chuck Possibum, Lawton Gaines, Barry Goldberg, and Chris Gilgun with gloves and aprons brushing on the paint remover. One of our fun days. Everybody got to work on the courting canoe. Here Jess Carnes was swinging a mean hammer driving tacks into some western red cedar planking. Just before canvassing, we noted the date and the names of the volunteers. Perhaps someone will find this interesting when this canvas comes off in another 100 years. The courting canoe was canvassed and filled in December, and after 5 weeks of curing, it was time to start the painting process with a coat of primer. Those are Stuart Fall's hands, with Vico and Kylan Huskinen, Jeff Morrill, Pete Murray, Gary Crossman, Chris Gilgun, and myself sanding the filler. With this many hands, it didn't take more than 10 minutes to do all the sanding. As I have mentioned, this courting canoe was a gift from Vico Huskinen from Hampstead, New Hampshire. The canoe had been owned by his father since 1960. Vico and his son Kylan joined in on the restoration after they saw how much fun we were having. One day, Vico's mother and sister, Sue and Chandra, came to visit and see what was going on. They are here with myself, Chuck Possibum, Stuart Fall, and Jeff Morrill. This was the day we spent installing some of the replacement combings. On another day, Vico came back to help Barry Goldberg fit a new king plank to cover a deck seam. All the replacement wood came from a large piece of Honduran mahogany. One of our most difficult tasks was color matching the new and old wood. Color matching. We found that the new wood responded well to a first application of a weak solution of lye and water, followed by 2 coats of mahogany stain. The old wood of the deck panels took only 1 coat of the stain for a decent color match. Here Jess Carnes appears to be enjoying applying the stain. This gel stain recently appeared at our local hardware store, and I took a chance on using it. I found it to be a big improvement over the liquid stuff. Eventually, we got close to being finished. Here it is waiting for those final touches. The stem bands and the flagpole sockets still needed to be installed for it to be ready to go to assembly. What's next for Norumbega? Well, that's always a good question. Recently, Bob LaVirtue dropped off 2 canoes, a Robertson and a Rushton. The Robertson is an open canoe with standard decks in pretty good condition. It would be an easy restoration. The Rushton may be more interesting. It's a 17-foot Indian girl with no inwales, no outwales, no thwarts, no seats, quite a few broken ribs, lots of broken planking, and 1 deck. This project has Norumbega written all over it. Another option on the table is to make a new building form for a small solo canoe and produce a new one in time for next year's auction. Stay tuned for news on this front. Thanks for watching. We will see you next year.